Well, welcome. I'm so glad you guys are here. Thanks for coming. Hopefully, this will be a productive hour or so for us. This session is going to be based on this book by John Kotter. Does anyone know who John Kotter is? Heard his name? If you've read any Harvard Business Review, he's probably come across your desktop at some point.
Was he a teacher in Brooklyn back in the 70s?
Maybe, I don't know.
Welcome back, Kotter.
Oh, there you go. I was like, there's a deep cut coming somewhere. I don't know what it is. But bonus points if you can figure that out. But I will say, my initial review of this book, if you notice, it's not super thick. It's about 190 pages, but it's really good. I feel like it really does a good job of balancing theoretical and practical. Like, at no point was I like, oh my gosh, this is so useless. I have no idea. It's a very good, gives you a really good framework and also some really good examples of how this is played out and other things as well. So hopefully this training will be just as beneficial, but I would highly recommend if anyone wants to read it, you can certainly borrow mine. It's just highlighted a lot. So, but yeah, so this is a good book, and hopefully this will be good for today. And really what we're going to base our conversation around is this 8-step framework for change. Change, I feel like, is something that is it can be hard, challenging, it's personal, it's emotional at times. And so the goal of this is to really help you understand, here's something we can do in 8 steps. I'm not going to say easy because it's not necessarily easily, but I think it's a lot more manageable when you can break something down into more or less 8 steps. And so that's really what we're going to focus on today. I encourage you to think through if you have changes that are coming up or that you're going through. Think through that and think through what I'm saying in that lens. And if you have questions or examples that you want to talk through, let's do it. I really want this to be interactive. If you've got questions, please ask. It's much more fun that way for me personally, for me to answer questions and for you guys to have this be as helpful as possible. So just to get some experience questions here. So how many of you have been in a leadership position? Doesn't have to be at St. Luke's, but have been in leadership at least 10 years? Show of hands. Few. Anybody more than 20 years? Right, a couple, yeah. So this question's for everybody, but especially those who've been in leadership for quite a while. What has changed in your team, department, or the organization since you first started as a leader? Yeah.
What hasn't changed?
What hasn't changed? There you go. But can you think of, like, are there some major shifts that you've experienced? Maybe not necessarily like the day-to-day changes, like, fax to email or things, but like even just as a leader, maybe how have the challenges changed?
Well, I think the whole change in payment in healthcare has really driven how we do things, what we do with it, how we document, and then just even the electronic medical record for me, that was not there when I first started and came on board.
Yeah, big change. Analog to digital and all of that, yeah.
I think there's a lot more data and information around how to be a leader, like in terms of, for example, like the just culture movement over the
Sure.
last 10 or 15 years and how we correct errors
Yeah,
and all the things that go along with that.
absolutely. Yeah, the requirements of leadership, the expectations too that people have of leaders has probably changed as well. Yeah, good. So I'm glad that you guys all realize that that's kind of a ridiculous question. So much has changed, right? Like, so much has changed, even from I've been at St. Luke's for 4 years, and I feel like so much has changed even in that time. And so change is something that we're going to have to deal with, and we can either do it well or we can do it poorly. So thinking over some of your past experiences, why have some change initiatives been successful and why have others failed, in your opinion? And we don't need to get specific if there's people in the room who might get offended, but just thinking about that, why do some succeed and why do some fail?
Sometimes it might be who's driving the change. Is it top down versus bottom up?
Yeah, absolutely. What else? What was that, Ava? Fear? Okay. Sure. Yeah. So maybe another way to think about that too is just the more unknowns that there are in the change, the harder it is to get people to buy in. Yeah. What were you going to say, Dr. Schultz?
Buy-in.
Yeah.
People buy in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. So thinking about those experiences, how do you feel like your experience of kind of change efforts or initiatives, because I'm sure we can all have some that come to mind, how does the success or failure of of those change initiatives impact how you view change in a specific organization? And I promise I'll start talking and giving you ideas instead of just asking you questions. But I'll just ride it out.
Yeah.
This fat will die. Absolutely.
I think that's a big piece. I mean, it used to be healthcare kind of went along and there was gradual changes, and now you barely even understand what's coming down the road, and it's already changed.
Right.
So you don't have the buy-in time, you don't have the hardwiring time,
Yeah.
and it makes it easier to say, let's write it out and see what happens next time.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. One of the things he talks about in the book is like how it used to be like a company or an organization would have to change significantly like once every decade or two, and now it's like it seems like every few years we need to change something fairly significant because of a lot of factors. Yeah, so that's good. So these are all great experiences, and we've touched on a lot of them. But in the book, he talks about there are basically 8 errors that inhibit change. So allowing too much complacency, like things are fine the way they are. We don't really need this change. Having that type of attitude where we're not eager to change, eager to grow, eager to improve is one thing that, if not addressed, can lead to an inability to change. Also, failing to create a sufficient, powerful guiding coalition. So as we talked about, we didn't have the right people, right? Maybe this person might be very good technically, might know something in and out, but they're not actually able to facilitate a whole change initiative. Underestimating the power of vision. We'll talk more about this when we get into the steps, but kind of the older ways to do it is do it because I say so. So this like authoritarian decree, or kind of the passive aggression version of authoritarian decree is micromanagement. So I'm not going to come out right and say like, you need to do this, but it's like, hey, here's the 100 step process on how to do it. And it doesn't really allow any freedom. So vision, however, cuts through that. Vision is able to cut through the status quo and actually invoke change. Fourth is under communicating the vision. How many of you have had conversations with employees where you're like, that thing that we're trying to do? And they're like, what? Like, what are you talking about? Or how many of you have been on that receiving end and they're like, this big thing that we've been spending months on? Like, what? Maybe I saw an email about that. Under communicating the change is another thing that inhibits change. Permitting obstacles to block the new vision. So that one might seem kind of contradictory, but this is especially when we need to look at like our structures. So like if we want to give, like say, employees more autonomy to be able to meet the needs of our patients, but yet we have 5 people that they need to get approval from first. Well, that structure is not really allowing that employee to live out the vision. So looking at things that are more hindering the new vision. Another example of that is metrics that measure the old vision versus the new vision. So if we are, looking at, let's say we wanted to have an initiative where we expect people to have at least 3 good catches a year, just making that up. But we don't have that any way of measuring that or rewarding that. Well, what's their incentive to really do it? They don't really have one unless they're really bought in. So that's another way that it does. Failing to create short-term wins. We need that momentum. We need kind of those short-term wins to celebrate and to keep us going, especially because all change requires some sort of sacrifice. People aren't going to make those sacrifices for a long time if they're not getting any sort of anything back. Like I'm sure you've probably heard the expression like the juice isn't worth the squeeze. Well, if we have to squeeze an orange for 3 years in order to get any juice out of it, no one's going to have orange juice. So that's the whole idea of short-term wins. Declaring victory too soon. So sometimes we'll have some, be like the first 6 months of a change initiative. We've seen some progress and we're like, all right, great, good job, guys. And then everything just kind of settles back down, kind of like what you were alluding to a little bit, Anna, could play into it as well. We can certainly celebrate, and we should celebrate short-term wins, but we need to make sure that we're always keeping our eye on the end result. And then neglecting to anchor changes firmly in corporate culture. Sorry for the typo. Just because we have changes in behavior doesn't mean we have changes in culture. And it's easy to conflate the two. But typically, changes in behavior will only last as long as the leader is present. You think of like these powerful CEOs that come in and they change things up and then they leave. The company's back to where they were more than likely because that person isn't there to kind of keep pushing everybody there. So those are some of the errors, the top errors that John Kotter discovered in his research. And as you guys might have predicted, the 8 steps coincide with those errors. Any questions, comments on those errors? How have you seen those in your practice? Any of those resonate with you and your team or your experiences more than others?
under communicating the vision, I think. When you said that, have you ever heard people say, I don't know anything about that?
Yeah.
I think that comes up frequently.
Sure. Yeah, and that's so easy to do too, because especially if we're involved on that planning, like we've been so engrossed in it for so long that you forget that not everybody does. It's so easy to do. Yeah.
As a new leader, allowing too much complacency is something that I've had to work on.
Yeah. Good. We'll keep thinking through these as we walk through the steps. So here's the 8 steps. We're going to walk through them each individually. And just so you know, that the way that he talks about it in the book is that really they are linear, so you should work through them all. There is a little bit of gap or overlap between the two, depending on organization and all of that, especially when you look at the planning and implementing phases, right? So you might be implementing, step 2, but kind of planning phase 3. So there is some of that, but it is really, it kind of builds a foundation, ultimately leading to a changed culture. And then one thing that was really helpful for me to understand too is that really the first 4 of these goes to defrost the status quo. So like kind of helping people realize the need for change, as well as kind of deconstructing what's already happening. I equate it to like if I wanted to add on to my house, it would be ridiculous if I didn't tear down where the addition was going to go and add on to it. If I just started building and then I'm like, all right, we'll just crawl through the window to get to the new addition, like that would be ridiculous. So the first 4 steps are really aimed at kind of realizing the deficiencies of the status quo in light of the vision. And then the next 3 steps are talking about this is where the most of the change happens. This is where we implement new policies, procedures, practices. And then the last one is what makes it a lasting change and really helps change the culture. All right, so the first step is establishing a sense of urgency. In the book, he says, without a sense of urgency, people won't give that extra effort that is often essential. They won't make needed sacrifices. Instead, they cling to the status quo and resist initiatives from above. A sense of urgency attacks the first error of allowing too much complacency in a team or an organization. And complacency is really just being okay with the status quo. Like, hey, we're doing okay. We're doing fine. Things are going well. You might hear things like, yeah, we have issues, but it's not really that bad. We're doing fine. But how does complacency take root in a team? I think it's one thing to acknowledge that complacency exists, but it's important for us to know where complacency comes from. And so in the book, they outlined these areas where complacency comes from. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on all of them. I do not know why this looks so awful. Absence of a major invisible crisis is number 1. I feel like that one is, we don't have to worry about that. We've got plenty of crises, especially in the last few years. Too many visible resources. So in the book, he talks about, having super lavish, facilities and, corporate parties that are super extravagant. I think we do a really good job of stewarding our resources here at St. Luke's. So I don't know that that's really a huge one for us. Low overall performance standards. So if the bar's not very high, everybody wins. Everyone gets 3s, 4s, and 5s on their performance reviews. That can kind of lead to this sense of like, hey, I'm doing just great. I just need to kind of maintain there. Structures that focus employee on very narrow goals. And this one's kind of I felt is a little bit confusing, but really what this breaks down to is kind of having structures that are, you worry about your job and nothing else. So I only need to worry about my job to be okay. When in reality, we should look at, okay, so if I'm a PAR in a clinic, I should also have some sort of incentive to make sure that the whole operation of the clinic is going well. That doesn't mean that I'm going to be disciplined or something like that if someone else or something else is going wrong, but give them that buy-in so that they can come up with ideas, and we'll talk about this a little bit in just a minute, so that they have more buy-in. How can we, the way that I kind of like to think about it is like, how do we have our employees not think of themselves as employees, but kind of co-owners, so to speak. Like if they were co-owner of their clinic or their department, how would their job look differently? And how do we inspire that kind of thinking to give them that autonomy to be able to continue and improve and meet needs? Internal measures that focus on wrong performance indexes. So you might have someone who does a great job in this performance index, but it doesn't actually indicate their performance at all. Like, well, there's probably a lot of different examples, but you can probably think of areas in your team where like, yeah, they may have a really good this, but that doesn't really translate into patient care or the quality of their work. So get those out of the way, and let's not kind of inflate the performance with these unnecessary measures. Lack of sufficient performance feedback from external sources. People should know how they're doing. I think sometimes as leaders, and especially as upper Midwestians, we tend to not want to hurt people's feelings or make them feel bad. But I think there's some benefit into sitting in that kind of uncomfortableness of, hey, I'm not doing what's expected of me right now. And not that we write people off for that, right? It's something that's like, it's okay to not be okay. Let's just not stay there. Okay, so we need to be able to give the news to them. One of the things that they talked about was have employees deal with unhappy patients or with unhappy customers so that they can see the implications of their performance issues. Also, kill the messenger of bad news, low transparency, low confrontation culture. I think that's a hard one for everybody, right? Having confrontation. But I've had countless of conversations with people throughout my career, of people who just, that's just Joanne, she's like that. No, we need to actually have the conversations, and we can't punish people who bring up questions, or who bring up the, hey, you know what, I actually don't feel valued right now. Okay, let's talk about that. Like, let's have that honest conversation. We can't be offended or be hurt when people share their feelings. We need to actually deal with that and address it. Human nature, with its capacity for denial. I think a lot of us who've been a leader for a while, it's impressive sometimes how some employees have the ability to be in denial of their performance, or to be like, hey, we have all of these complaints about you, and we need to address them. And then they'll say, yeah, but this one patient said I made her day. It's like, well, good. I'm glad that happens, but that doesn't negate all of what is going on. Like, we're glad that that's happening there. Let's bring that into the whole, all of your responsibilities. And then too much happy talk from senior management. So the numbers are bad, but they're always putting a positive spin on this. This one's really hard for me. I'm pretty optimistic. Kim can probably attest to that. We were in a meeting, and it's like, I like to try to find the positive, but sometimes we need to, again, sit in that discomfort of like, hey, this didn't go well. Let's figure it out. Let's go from there. So, and I think a lot of these sources of complacency, as I've been thinking about it and kind of reflecting on the book, I think a lot of it comes from good intentions, right? Like, we want our employees to be happy. We don't want them to feel discouraged or feel like that we don't value them. But at the same time, I think we're missing some opportunities to build in some urgency when we avoid those types of conversations. How do we build urgency? Create a crisis. This is his words, not mine. I don't know that I necessarily agree with that. I think, especially given our context, I think we can let that one go. But the whole point of that is, maybe you let some performance drop so you can see, hey, here's what's happening. If we let this continue, boom, X, Y, Z will happen. So that's a strategy that you can use. Eliminate obvious examples of excess. So getting rid of the company jet, stuff like that. Again, I don't think we need to worry about that one. Set goals so high the status quo must change. So I think this one we have to be careful with, right? The goals still need to be realistic, right? They need to be grounded in reality, and we need to support them. So we can't just be like, okay, we expect 2,000 ED visits a day by 2023. How on earth are we going to do that? Like, that seems so impractical. And just to be able to give, I think that's an unrealistic number. Yeah. Sorry, that's probably a bad example. Too soon. But if we don't give any support, any time for training, any investment in new technologies or anything, like, we're just setting people up to fail, and that's demoralizing. So we need to figure out how to stretch our employees enough where they need to change without just totally breaking the spirits. Insist more people be held accountable for broad measures of performance. So again, going back to that clinic example, are our employees being held accountable for just their specific job duties, or are there opportunities that we can stretch that out into almost like what we've done with some of the service lines? So not just looking at that one particular visit, but the whole thing. I don't know exactly what that looks like for us, but are there opportunities to create more buy-in? And really the positives with that is that, one, it creates more awareness of what's going on. So if we had people who were bought into the whole process, and maybe they have to spend a little bit of time shadowing the other elements of that process, maybe we can get some more creative ideas on how to cut out unnecessary things, how to have a better patient experience for our patients. So that's the thing that I think is the most beneficial of this one, and can really help people, especially if we have structures in place to reward them as well for that. for those initiatives. Ensure people talk to dissatisfied customers, suppliers, and stakeholders. You know, again, use this with discernment. I think we don't want to send people to the wolves necessarily, but you know, maybe even you handle a complaint, and then afterwards you meet with that employee and say, hey, you know what? I believe in you. You know, you've got a lot of good things going for you, but here's a complaint we received, and I just want you to read through it. And talk through, like, how does this make you feel? You know, what do you think needs to change? Might be a great tool if we can't allow people to actually speak directly with our patients who are dissatisfied. Force more relevant data and honest discussion into management meetings. We don't have to have a show of hands. I'm just going to assume everyone's going to raise their hand. How many people have sat through a meeting where they're like, why are we talking about this number? Like, what does this number actually mean? Not saying that all numbers are bad, and I'm sure if Eric was here, he'd explain why I'm wrong. But maybe not all numbers are good for all types of meetings. So how can we make sure we're just focusing again on the important meetings or the important numbers and making sure that they're discussed honestly? We're not sugarcoating it. We're not doing the happy talk. Put more honest discussion of the organization and team problems in communication. So let's talk through those. You know, when we give updates, you know, if we're posting things on our unit or whatever it might be, like, let's be honest and give more of a realistic snapshot of how we're doing. Now, again, there needs to be discernment and wisdom, right? We just don't want to be like, this place is burning. Like, that's not what it is. But are there ways that we can start to bring people in more than just the employee forums of how we're doing as a department, how we're doing as an organization? I think that's one of the cool things about Safety Huddle is going and seeing all the stats for the next day. I'm like, oh, wow, I understand now why nursing was so busy yesterday. You know, like, it helps also to just have more investment and buy-in in the organization. And then bombard people with information on future opportunities, the benefits of those opportunities, and the team/organization's inability to meet the opportunities. So this one sounds kind of confusing, but until I read this book, I didn't realize the previous organization that I worked with did this actually very, very well. We were a small third-party administrator. We offered cafeteria plans, so like COBRA insurance, FSAs, HSAs, all that stuff. And for years, the goal was we want to get to $10 million in sales for a year. That was our goal. Once we do that, we can actually have access to some bigger brokerage firms that can get us into every state in the country. But we can't do that right now unless we have XYZ. I don't remember what they all were. But we all knew that. So we all knew, like, okay, if we want to grow as a company and kind of be the North Dakota, you know, competing with firms in LA and New York and Atlanta, that's what we need to do. And it was something that was very helpful. So for us, you know, I think of, I remember even Jane, when we were talking through when you first got here, some of the things that you've done around the trauma. Like, I think you kind of use this tactic as well of like, hey, we want to get to a level 1 trauma because then it allows us to do X, Y, Z. But to do that, we need to do all of these things. So that's a really good way to help build a sense of urgency because it builds in an optimistic vision already, which is also super helpful. Any thoughts on these ideas for building urgency? All right. So the second step then is to create a guiding coalition. Change, especially significant change, is difficult to accomplish. Powerful force is required to sustain the process. Not any one individual, I don't care how charismatic you are, is not able to do that for the long term, especially as we've talked about in how the climate has changed. You know, I think, you know, back in 40 years ago, you probably could have one charismatic leader come and do a lot of change in a smaller organization. But like, especially if you think of the size and scope of St. Luke's, like one person to change, you know, to enact any sort of change that is broad, sweeping, and lasting is just setting them up to fail. They're not going to be able to do the things necessary. So in order to enact meaningful change, a strong guiding coalition is always needed. One with the right composition, the right level of trust, and a shared objective. So building this team is an essential part of any significant change. And I think sometimes it gets overlooked a little bit because our structure is a little bit imbalanced, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But I'm sure, and we've already talked about it, you know, we've all been a part of initiatives that have just kind of fizzled out, you know, communities or committees that maybe started strong and then they just kind of fizzled out. And I saw this quote in the book and I thought it was really, really good. It says, after a while, the work is done by 3 or 4, mostly the chair and a few others. The rest of the members rubber stamp the ideas of the small group, but neither contribute nor feel any commitment to the process. Sooner or later, the group can't get a consensus on key recommendations. The recommendations fall on deaf ears, or when it tries to implement an idea and runs into a wall of passive resistance. With much hard work, the committee makes small contributions, but they come on slowly and incrementally. How many of you guys can resonate with feeling like that? I'm sure all of us can. And again, goes back to how this eventually will shape our view on how our organization views change. If you experience this once, it might not change your view. But if you've experienced this 3 or 4 or 5 times, you're probably going to feel like this organization doesn't really care about change. Things are just a fad, like Anna said. We can just wait it out. It becomes more of the mentality around change. So what do we look for in a guiding coalition that will help us have the right sort of engine for this change? Oh boy, it's fancier than I thought. So there's 4 basic things. Position power, so enough key players on board, especially the mainline managers, so that those left out cannot easily block progress. So I think that's a key one. I think sometimes, we want the dream team of like, oh, let's get the whole executive team, which is great, but just because they have big titles doesn't mean that that's what's needed to go. And I think the big thing to focus on is those left out cannot easily block the progress. So think about in your mind, think about in your team. If there's something you wanted to roll out, which team members would possibly stand in the way? Do you have a very influential person who's been there for a long time? They probably would be needed on this type of group. Even though they're not a leader, quote unquote, they don't have a position of authority, they are still needed in order to move change. Expertise. Are there a variety of relevant points of view so that informed, intelligent decisions will be made? So is there a diversity of discipline, work experience, nationality, gender, all of those things? Are we having a diverse group so that we're not missing anything and we truly represent the group we're trying to change? Credibility. Does the group have enough people with good reputations in the organization so that pronouncements will be taken seriously by other employees? So we don't want the people that are like, oh, that person's just gunning for themselves. They don't care about other people. They're on the guiding coalition. Yeah, that's going to taint the reputation. So we want to be careful to make sure that we are getting the right people that have credibility, that are trusted, hopefully even well-liked would be great. And then lastly, leadership. Does the group include enough proven leaders to be able to drive the change process? And this is where I want to take a little bit of an aside and talk about the difference between leadership and management. And he talks about it in the book, and I think it's really helpful for us to think. I feel like in some ways some of the trend is going to like leadership is better and management is bad, but it's really not true. In a lot of ways, they're the flip side of the same coin, right? And so how Kotter describes the difference is that management is a set of processes that can keep complicated systems of people, technology running smoothly. So the most important aspects of management include planning, budgeting, organizing, staffing, controlling, and problem solving. So this is what keeps the day-to-day motions going. So management produces a degree of predictability and order and has the potential to consistently produce short-term results expected by various stakeholders. So patients, high quality of care. For the board, keeping costs down. Things like that. Planning and budgeting. Are they able to make sure that we can do what we can with the resources that we have? Controlling and problem solving, managing, monitoring results, identifying deviations from the plan, and then figuring out how to address those. That is all the skill of management, and that is actually very, very important. Leadership, on the other hand, is a set of processes that creates organizations in the first place or adapts them to significantly changing circumstances. Leadership defines what the future should look like, aligns people with that vision, and inspires them to make it happen despite obstacles. And so leadership produces change, often to a dramatic degree, and it has the potential to be extremely useful when change comes to new products, new service lines, meeting the needs of extremely kind of out there ideas. Or maybe even it's like new approaches to how we deal with the labor force. How do we make the organization more competitive? Leadership establishes the direction, develops the vision, and often it's focused on the distant future. So management is kind of like, let's look at our year. The leadership looks at like, let's look at the decade or even for 5 years, or, let's look more long term. And so ironically, you actually need far less leaders in this sense than managers, because as things grow, you need more and more people to make things happen and to maintain order. And so that's where, again, kind of a little bit of an aside, but I think it's helpful that we have a lot of like I said, I feel like there's a lot of like management is not as good as leadership, but really it's so necessary. Because we need all of our experts to be able to keep things going and make things go. I think, I mean, if you want a good example of leadership and management, I think our CEOs are a great example of that. Like, are both Eric and Nick both of those things? Yeah, but Nick is definitely more apt, has a much bigger aptitude for leadership than Eric does, and Eric has a much bigger aptitude for management than Nick does, and they work together so well because of that. And so that's where, again, we need both of those if we're going to make change happen, especially change that's going to last. And a guiding coalition with good managers but poor leaders will not succeed. A managerial mindset will develop plans but not vision. It will vastly undercommunicate the need for direction, and the direction of change, and it will control rather than empower people. And so that's why we need both. The next element that we talk about, so we need to have the right balance of people, but within that people, there needs to be trust. And in the book, he says, when trust is present, you will usually be able to create teamwork. When it is missing, you won't. And so we need absolutely to build trust. But really, the big question is, how do we build trust? So as leaders, how have you experienced building trust on a team, whether you were the leader or you were a member of the team?
By doing what you say you'll do and doing your best.
Yeah, walking the walk. Mm-hmm. How many people have done like team building exercises? Yes, no. Do you think those work? No. Yes, that would be an example, but we've got some head shaking. Why no? Why don't you think those work?
Oh, I think it depends what kind of team building.
Sure,
talking about.
sure.
Going out and doing a high ropes course or something as team building, I've never found it being particularly successful.
Sure.
As a team, I think it's fun to do that.
Yeah.
I think, for building trust, it occurs over a period of time, and it's like being presented with challenges and then successfully overcoming them.
Yeah.
Like in the ER where I work is a classic example. When a nurse or somebody's new, there's not a lot of trust either way. But
Mm-hmm.
if you have a couple crises and you get to know each other, then you start to trust each other more. So.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I did some of it when I first came here. I said, like, that's my jam. Like, I love that stuff. But I
Yeah.
felt my team was like, seriously?
No.
Like, they pulled muscles for my roles. But, and I think it was because they're so driven in wanting to,
Yeah.
like, hey, is this adding value to my day right now? No, not really, because we have patients that we need to take care of.
Part of it depends on the people, right? But in the book, he talks about 20 years ago, it was always like offsite or like company parties, golfing, while that still can work, it takes an extraordinary amount of time. It also works best when there's only like if the people are married, if only one of them works, because when you have two people who work, their demand is much greater, right? And so typically it doesn't work as well. And also the biggest detriment is that it kind of creates this, you're either in with us or you're not. So it doesn't allow a lot of differences. It kind of negative groupthink takes place, and it's like, oh, you don't like golf? Well, then I guess we're not inviting, Jim on the next retreat, and that's just not how it is. So the shift has been more to off-site work meeting. So maybe you have a high ropes course in there, but really what you're focusing on is, let's get away from the normal hustle bustle, and we're going to spend time focused specifically on talking about our vision, talking about our goals, and having honest conversations about how we're doing. And if we focus on those three things, that aids in that trust over time. Because I totally agree. Time is probably one of the biggest factors of building trust. And so these little offsites can be kind of like little boosters. I think my boys are really into the Hot Wheels right now, and I don't know if you guys have Hot Wheels, but like you can go down the track, and then there's like these little boosters that are basically like a little pitching machine that spin, and you hit one of them, and it just keeps you going faster till you get to the next one. And so I feel like in some ways that's what those events should be for, as well as also being productive. The company that I came from as an HR group, we did this every spring and every fall. We'd spend one day offsite, and we played some games, but it was just like, how are we really doing? Like, do we feel like we're accomplishing what we need to? And it was a really great experience where I could feel like I didn't have to be the HR guy who just says what should be said. I didn't have to worry about offending my boss. Like she would start and be like, here's what I think we're struggling with, or what I'm struggling with. And it was just a great time to build that trust, because it was a safe place. We could speak honestly, and then we could bring that into our lives, and it didn't totally disrupt our lives. So So yeah, just food for thought. Thinking about that, are there opportunities that you can do that in your team, and especially within that guiding coalition? So for you on your team, you're probably like, oh, I don't have anyone who reports to me. But are there ways that you can, for these change initiatives, are there ways that you can use meetings like that, or even just come in here if it's available for 4 hours, and the first hour is lunch, then you play a game, and then you guys can get to business. Are there ways that we can do that to help build trust there? And once you have that trust in the guiding coalition, it's easier to come to a shared agreement on what the goal is. We can have, because then I know Brett's not just trying to get something for therapy. Cole's not just trying to get something for the float pool. Garrett's not just trying to get something for the access center. It's no, I trust this person. I know what Garrett makes Garrett tick. I know what makes Anna tick. I have trust that they're looking out for the best of what we're trying to do. And that helps us get to a shared goal. And then we can create and develop a vision and strategy. So clarifying the direction of change is important, and developing a vision is basically what that is. Because not all people will agree on the direction, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can do things. Even if we're all on agreement on, like, hey, a change needs to happen, there might be hundreds of different views on what that change actually is. So developing a vision and strategy kind of cuts through all of those differences once the guiding coalition can establish that. It cuts through the forces that support the status quo far better than authoritarian approaches such as the top-down authoritarian decree or the micromanaging, because it allows people to actually make it their own on some level, right? If I have a vision like St. Luke's vision, right, I can take that to mean something different than it means for all of you, because my job is different than all of yours. And so that's a good thing. That's what we should do. And that's really where the power of vision comes from. So why is vision essential? Vision is a picture of the future with some implicit or explicit commentary on why people should strive to create that future. So a vision clarifies the direction of change and therefore simplifies hundreds or thousands of more detailed conversations. I don't know if you've been a part of committees or things like that where it's like, we've had 5 meetings on just establishing the vision statement. Like, it can take a long time, but imagine spreading that out to everybody in the organization, allowing every person to have input. That takes such a long time. And so once we have a vision set up, it allows us to be able to actually to be able to answer the question, is this in line with our vision? I think that's one of the most powerful questions we can ask, especially when determining our priorities and what we're going to devote our time to. The vision also motivates people to take action in the right direction, even if they're painful. So working out, right? Everyone here, except for probably Jake, because he's the fitness guy, working out is a sacrifice. Waking up at 5 in the morning and going for a bike ride is much harder than staying in bed and sleeping. But why do I do it? Why do we do that kind of stuff? Because we have a vision of being healthier, living a longer life, playing with our kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, whatever, great-grandpuppies, whatever's important to us. That's what motivates us. So a good vision should do that, right? Visions are not dystopian. They're utopian. We should find comfort in them. And then vision coordinates the actions of different people quickly and efficiently. So if I gave you all a vision, in the book they use a good example of creating a vision. So like let's say we're all outside. We're at a cafeteria outside somewhere in Arizona or something like that. And all of a sudden it looks like it's going to start raining. And we look over there and there's like this huge apple tree that will cover all of us. So the authoritarian would say, hey, everybody, let's go move over to the apple tree. Okay, that kind of will work. The micromanager might say, all right, everybody, we need to stand up. We need to grab all of our things, make sure we clean up all of our garbage. Let's walk single file over to the apple tree and let's go sit down, spread out, and everyone eat our lunch over there. A vision says, hey, guys, it looks like it's going to rain. Why don't we go over to the apple tree, and let's have an apple with our lunch as well. So it's a very simple thing, but you're creating a vision of, hey, yeah, I really could go for an apple. That sounds great. It's creating that vision, creating that momentum so that they can actually do it willfully rather than being forced to. So characteristics of an effective vision, it should be imaginable. So people should be able to picture what it looks like. Hopefully, as I was giving you that very small vision statement, you could see an apple tree. You could see where that looks like. It's desirable. Again, it has to be appealing to long-term interests. It's got to be feasible. So again, it can't be this impossible task. It needs to be something that we can actually accomplish. It needs to be focused. So it needs to be clear enough to provide guidance in decision making. Again, is this in line with our vision? does it actually allow us to make decisions based on the vision? Flexible allows individual initiative and alternative responses in light of changing conditions. So it gives people that autonomy. So what our vision looks like in action today might look different than in 10 years from now. And that's okay, because time is different now than it was back then. The circumstances are different. The market's different. All sorts of things are different. And so it needs to be flexible. And it also needs to be communicable, easy to communicate. In the book, he talks about there should be a 5-minute rule. If you can't explain your vision to somebody in 5 minutes, it's probably not a very good vision statement. I kind of think of it like the difference between pop music and opera music. Why do people listen to pop music more than opera music? Because it's catchy. They can remember the words. It's in English, a lot of them. It gets stuck in your head and you hum it for hours or days or weeks. I don't know if I've ever hummed an opera song, and I actually do listen to opera sometimes. Not very often, and don't tell anybody, but I do. Classical music's the same way. It's beautiful, it's robust, it's moving, but it's not easily shareable, right? It doesn't hook people right away. It's not something that's repeatable. And so that's what we need to have in a good vision statement. So creating an effective vision, I just found this was kind of helpful. So he proposed this as like, here's a general kind of process of how it happens. And we're not going to go into this like crazy, but it's in the PowerPoint that I sent you. But it's just a good idea. And for me, it kind of felt good because it was kind of like have a first draft and then have people, review it. Talks about teamwork, talks about the head and the heart. I felt like it kind of gives you a good rubric to kind of go through and review if you need to work through that vision. All right, number 4, communicating the change vision. All right, I found this quote really helpful. It says, the real power of a vision is unleashed only when most of those involved in an enterprise or activity have a common understanding of its goals and direction. In the book, he talks about the hardest work of the guiding coalitions is letting go of the predictability and comfort of the status quo, letting go our future options and coming to grips with the sacrifices needed to make change, coming to trust others. But yet, after all of that hard work is done, and arguably the hardest work has been done, the guiding coalition often acts as though everyone else in the organization should become clear and comfortable with the resulting vision in a fraction of the time. So like, we've done all this work, it's taken us months to get a vision. We've sent you 3 emails. How are you not on board with this? Like, we need to give people that time as well. And time, not only time, but also repetition. We need to communicate more than we think. For us who have been involved in the planning and the guiding coalition, we have a biased view on how we feel our communication is being received and communicated. I was a management communications major in college, and one of my professors one time, he talked about organizational communication. He goes, kind of a good rule of thumb is if we feel like we're communicating well, we're probably not communicating enough. If we feel like we're over communicating, we're probably communicating enough. Take it for what you want, but I think that's a good rule of thumb. Like if we're like, yeah, I'm sure people kind of know, we probably need to keep going and keep communicating in order for us to really have our vision and our message be received from everybody. Elements in an effective vision communication: simplicity. All jargon, technobabble must be eliminated. Man, I still, a lot of times when I talk with, some of our employees and they just tell me about what issue they're having, I'm like, can you stop? I need like 4 definitions of what you're saying, because they're so technical, they're so special, and they're so talented, but I don't know what you're saying. And so, and even if you do, simplicity is almost always better. So even if your audience would know all of the jargon that you might use, we need to cut that out so that it's simple. Again, think of a pop song. We're not going to have 5-syllable words in a pop song, right? We're going to have smaller words. We're going to have more emotive words. We're going to have words that, think about our word or even letter economy. We want to have the most amount of impact with the smallest amount of words. So that's kind of the idea of simplicity. We want it to be simple. And that's really hard. I think I saw a quote one time that was like, if only I had time to be simple. Like, being simple and concise is much harder than being long-winded and firing off a paragraph. Metaphor, analogy, and example. A verbal picture is worth 1,000 words. And this one is kind of interesting. And I was trying to think of how we could apply this here at St. Luke's. The example one of the examples that they gave in the book I thought was really interesting. They used an example as a vision for, this is a tech company that was kind of trying to be a pioneer in the global market, I guess. And their vision was, we need to become less like an elephant and more like a customer-friendly Tyrannosaurus Rex. So if you think about it, think of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, right? What comes to mind when you think of a T-Rex? Short arms, yeah. Yes. Okay, what else? Big teeth. What? Vicious, right? Tenacious. But now they're customer friendly. So it's kind of a weird, but think about it. So their idea was we want to be nice, we want to be agile, we want to be active, we want to be ferocious towards our competition, but we want to still be customer friendly. Versus an elephant, which I guess they're big. They're actually kind of mean, so it might not be the best analogy. But you can see the differences, right? An elephant versus a Tyrannosaurus invoke very different things, and so that's the idea. Are there metaphors that you could use? Are there images that you could use to help communicate the vision? Multiple forms. This is a huge one. So are we communicating it as much as we can? Main artery, weekly meetings, touch-ins, emails, tweets, even depending on if marketing is involved, things like that. And I think the thing that is huge with multiple forums is big meetings, small meetings as well. I think a lot of us think that communication has to be like an official email or memo, but one of the things that he talks about in the book is giving this vision for, if let's just say like we were this guiding coalition. If we view all of our job through this new vision, we will find many opportunities, even just talking with staff. So like you go and talk to your staff. Hey, how's it going today? It's going pretty good, but we're kind of struggling to keep up with the volume. Like, oh, I totally get that. Like the volume is hard. Let me know if there's anything I can help you with. But this is really, you're doing a great job, and this will really help us get to our goal of being 2,000 ED patients in the day. That's a little way that you can reinforce that vision without having to have a big corporate meeting. And so if we kind of allow that type of consistency of message, it'll really impact, and that'll really be the more meaningful conversations too. Because think about it, when you have a big meeting, probably a lot of the most useful stuff is what happens right after that meeting, right? Or the one-on-one conversations you have with your leader or with your employees are probably the most beneficial. So the way that we can really spread our vision is through those multiple forms. Repetition. Let ideas sink in. Ideas sink in deeply only after they've been heard many times. It's kind of like the I don't know. I always tell my kids, that I love them, and it's like my goal is to tell them I love them so much that they roll their eyes at me, because they know it's coming, right? So it's kind of the same thing with our vision. We need to be repeating it so often that our employees know it's coming. They know what I'm going to say. They know the vision. But try not to be annoying. Leadership by example. Again, I think this was mentioned earlier about how we build trust. We have to make sure that we are being consistent with our vision. And then the same way, explain those seeming inconsistencies. He gave one example in the book. He goes, if there's consistencies to your vision, your employees will notice them. They will probably notice more than you will, but we need to address these inconsistencies even if we cannot immediately remove that inconsistency. So the example that he gave was, with all the cost cutting that was going on out of necessity through the company, it's inexcusable for any of us to be wasting money, especially on unneeded luxuries. Within this context, we have decided that the offices and furnishings of our executives are not justifiable. At present, selling headquarters and moving to less luxurious surroundings would cost more than it would save. But we will continue to look for a cost-effective and practical way to reduce this sign of excess. So we're here talking about cost savings, and apparently in this company, the executive suite was, immaculate and gorgeous. And they're like, hey, you know what? We get that looks weird, right? We're asking everyone to cut, and it looks like we're not. But it's actually going to cost us a lot more to relocate. So we're admitting that it looks like an inconsistency, but here's where we are, and here's what we're going to commit to. So having those kind of things, stating the perception, is something I've started to say a lot. Here's what people are thinking, so you should address it, and show that it shows that you're aware of it, and it shows that it's not actually an inconsistency, or if it is, that you're going to do something about it, that you're going to be willing to change. All right, so those first four, remember, we're kind of deconstructing the status quo, and now we get to move into more implementing the change. So empowering employees for broad-based action. Once employees have a vision and understand it, we need to empower them to use their passions, their skills, creativity, and take action to live out the vision. And as leaders, we need to look for ways to give people permission to experiment, to try things, to think creatively within the parameters of our vision. Once employees have the freedom to think creatively, it'll open the floodgates for change and engagement. I think one thing that's kind of an interesting question that I like to ask, especially like people who sometimes struggle, is like, do you prefer to ask for permission or to ask for forgiveness? And I think that can kind of tell you if they're going to fit in to a certain culture or not. I think for a lot of good reasons, I think St. Luke's is a kind of ask for permission at times, which is fine. One's not right or wrong, but it's one of those things that is a real thing. And so how do we give our employees permission to have the freedom to be able to be creative and make decisions? Again, all within the vision. So we can't be having people, breaking regulations and all of that, but how do we give them the freedom? And really, it's by attacking 4 barriers. So the 4 barriers to empowerment are formal structures that make it difficult. So again, if we are going to say, our frontline staff have the opportunity to do X, Y, Z for a patient if they notice it. Well, if we don't actually give them the tools to implement it, if they have to get approval from 3 people before they can do something about it, then we're not really actually allowing them to engage in the way that we would want them to. So what are those formal structures that need to change? Another thing would be the example that I used earlier of we want everyone to have at least 3 or 4 good catches a year, but we have no way of measuring it. We have no way of rewarding it. We have no way of praising them for it. Well, that's not really going to empower them to do it because they have no incentive to do it other than just sheer will. Next is a lack of needed skills to undermine the action. This is probably one of my favorite parts in the book and could probably be its own training session. But giving the people the right skill training, but also the right attitude and behavior training. And that idea just kind of really stuck with me of like, man, attitude training. Other than my initial thought of, man, I could think of like 3 or 4 people that need to attend attitude training. But think about that. Like if we're really wanting to be, think about the patient above all else. Are there people that we know who might need to go through some training on what that means and what that is expected to look like? Probably, right? That could probably be an interesting little exercise. So are we giving people the skills needed, the abilities, the trainings, the resources needed to actually engage? Personnel and information systems make it difficult to act. That one also is it talks a little bit about the performance metrics, things like that. And then bosses discourage actions aimed at implementing the new vision. So that is a crucial one because if you don't have leaders on board, they are not going to go quietly. They are going to make it known. They are going to be disruptive. They are going to be counterintuitive to your vision. And the best way to deal with them is honest conversations. So having those crucial conversations with them and say, hey, I know this has been a difficult transition. I want to hear about why, what concerns you have. I want to know, and get that out there. And I think part of the harsh reality of being a leader is that at some point down the road, we might need to just get rid of that person. And that's not a thing that any of us want to do. But if we have people who are continually against our vision, against our values, against our norms of our culture, that ultimately is going to be a problem. And it's one that's going to be much harder to fix with them here if they're not willing to change. If they're willing to change, fantastic. That's great. We want that because that also produces it moves them from a reluctant kind of participant to someone who's actively going to do it. And those team members can see that change in their leader, are probably going to be a lot more willing to go with the changes as well. Empowering people to affect change, communicate a sensible vision to employees. Again, if employees have a shared sense of purpose, it will be easier to initiate actions to achieve that purpose. Make structures compatible with the vision. I'm not going to go through this because I feel like I kind of gave you a sneak peek on the previous page, but and for the sake of time, we've got 20 minutes left, so we're doing okay. But that's a big thing. We need to empower our employees to, within reason to be able to invoke change. 6, generating short-term wins. The job of management is to win in the short term while making sure you're in an even stronger position to win in the future. I don't know if this is true, but I'm pretty sure I've heard Eric Lowen say basically this exact same thing. And it really helped me understand kind of our role. It's like, yeah, we do want to make sure that we are keeping the long-term vision, doing things in the short term that are going to be impactful, but we also can't lose sight of the long-term vision. And so that's something that we absolutely need to do. And I think by figuring out what these short-term wins are, can help us to not only keep people on the path to the long-term vision, but it can help people get bought into the vision who aren't maybe sold right away. And so what is a good short-term win? So a short-term win should be visible. Large number of people can see it for themselves. The result is whether the result is real or just passing hype or passing fad. So we want people to be able to see it. That doesn't mean that like everyone should notice it on their own, but like be putting it in the main artery. Like, what if we shared short-term wins like that in the main artery, or employee forums or things like that? How can we kind of get that recognition, make sure that it's visible? Next is unambiguous. There can be little argument over the results. It's clear and things have improved. So this is where we don't want to get into gimmicks or like manipulating the numbers of like, oh, if we can kind of spin it this way. Like, first of all, that's never going to last long term. Second of all, we have smart people who work here and they're going to figure it out what you're doing. And so that's not what it needs to be. It needs to be a clear cut. You need to be able to see that this was an actual improvement. And then next, there has to be a nexus. So this win was done because of the actions of the change initiative. It can't be like something like it would be foolish for it to say, hey, we reduced costs, during the first month of COVID. Well, we really didn't. We just didn't have any patients. So we also have to keep in mind that our revenues were way down too. So like that would be an example of a bad short-term win. We need to be able to have things that are visible. People can recognize it. They're unambiguous. It's clear. And it was clearly done by the change effort that we are working through. So developing those short-term wins is huge. The role of short-term wins, it provides evidence that the sacrifices were worth it. So again, thinking about working out, you getting up early every day to work out. A short-term win is, hey, I've lost 5 pounds. That's a great short-term win. Are you where you need to be? Maybe, maybe not. But it's a good short-term win. We should celebrate that. My sacrifices, the lack of sleep was worth it. Reward change agents with a pat on the back. It's good to see that. It's good to see that our efforts are working, and it's a great way to provide recognition, a great way to encourage people, and to really keep that momentum going. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of Dave Ramsey. He's like a financial guy. One of the things, whether you agree with it or not, he's kind of famous for this snowball method of paying off your debt. So it's not actually like the most efficient in terms of like lowering the cost, but his whole argument is that you start with the smallest amount, you pay that off first, then you go to the next smallest amount, and it's based on this idea of if people see that, hey, I actually got one paid off, versus I reduced the one with the largest interest rate by $1,000. Like, that's not nearly as successful, or that's not as much of a good feeling as a win as paying off one whole student loan. And so his idea is if you kind of do those short-term wins, people will stick with it because they feel like they're accomplishing more, even though it might actually cost them more in the long run. Idea. So I felt like for me that helped me make sense of the short-term wins. It also helps fine-tune vision and strategies. So short-term wins give the guiding coalition concrete data on the viability of their ideas. So if we meet these, like think about for our strategic pillars, right? Those are kind of 3-year goals. We have those short-term wins, more or less built into them, so we can see, is this going to get us to where we need to go, or do we need to change things, or did we encounter things that we maybe didn't expect to do. Keep bosses on board. It provides those higher in the hierarchy with evidence that the transformation is on track. I'm sure Kim can probably attest to this. If we have 2 managers who are saying, hey, I've got these new projects, one of them comes and says, hey, I don't have any idea how it's going, and the other one says, hey, we have about 5% increase in revenues for the last quarter. She's probably going to be willing to sit with this one a little bit longer than the other one who doesn't have any idea of how it's going. It doesn't have any measurable results. And so that's just another way, even just strategically, that we can keep people on board with our vision. And then again, builds momentum. So kind of thinking about that snowball effect, it also turns neutrals into supporters, because maybe the person who's skeptical in the first few rounds of meetings go, oh, wow, they actually saved $25,000 this quarter. Okay. Maybe I'll give it a fair shake next time. It helps to do that, and kind of creates this heritage of change. But the big thing, again, remembering one of the errors, we can't declare victory too soon. Just because we've had short-term wins doesn't mean that everything is over. It doesn't mean that we've arrived. It just means that we're on the right track and we're doing the right things. 7, consolidating gains and producing more change. So this stage is basically like, all right, we've got this momentum from our from all of these short-term wins, so we need to keep going. We need to use that momentum to keep pushing us. So that may mean broadening it out. So maybe we just did a test pilot of some area. Maybe that means now expanding it to other areas of the organization. Maybe it means moving on to the next iteration of what we're doing. So this first time, like I was talking with Garrett the other day with the Access Center. Great example of that. Okay, we did these few clinics really well. Now we're going to expand to these, and now we're going to keep going. So that's a great way, a good example of consolidating gains and producing more change. So we need to keep that going. I thought this is a really helpful quote as well. In successful transformations, the guiding coalition uses the credibility afforded by the short-term wins to push forward faster, tackling even more or bigger projects. So again, it gives us as the guiding coalition a little bit more clout to say, hey, look what we've accomplished. Here's what we want to do next. And it allows us to have a little bit more credibility. People are maybe willing to give us a little bit more of a chance that they wouldn't have if we would have asked for that thing first without kind of some proven success. A successful change effort requires more change, not less. Use the momentum. We feel like we've already talked about that. More help. Additional people are brought in, promoted, and developed to help with all the changes. So again, this is where we need probably some more managers at this point. In our guiding coalition, we might need people with more skills to keep our increasingly complex thing running and operating smoothly. Senior management can now focus on maintaining clarity and the shared purpose of the overall effort and keeping urgency levels up. So again, remember that leadership, keeping the vision going, keeping it, celebrating, but also keeping going and allowing the managers to continue to do their thing. Project management and leadership from below. This is where we get actual change and people buying in and wanting to give more than they maybe need to. And Jake can attest to this. One of the cool things that we've seen in the employee advisory committee is, we had an initial group of leaders, and now we've got more people stepping up saying, hey, I want to be an officer. I want to, help lead this subcommittee. That's because they've bought into the vision and they understand that where we're going is needed, and they want to be a part of it. And so that's something that is absolutely huge, because then too, it's no longer just the driving or the leading coalition pushing it. It's everyone else is pushing it along too, and that just multiplies the momentum. And then reduction of unnecessary interdependencies. This one also is, I feel like, a really interesting concept. They talked about the idea of, in a complex organization, everything is tied together. So like in this room, nothing is connected really. So like I can move this chair and it doesn't matter. But imagine that every single thing in this room was connected to everything else in the room. So if I move this chair, it moves the table, that chair, it moves even Adam maybe, it moves the projector. In an organization that's very interdependent, that happens, right? So like if we make a change in our billing, think of all the different changes that has on other places in the organization. So part of this phase is looking at, okay, do these things need to be connected? Do we need to have that interdependence? Sometimes you might, right? You might need that. But there might be ways that we don't need to. Like, why does this go to here and then to here? Why can't it just go from here to there? So that's where we can start looking. And also, too, as we get more people that are kind of boots on the ground folks, they can point some of those things out to us, and we can start making more efficiencies to make it easier. And then the last thing is anchoring the new approach in culture. So now, if you remember back to the very beginning, so we've deconstructed the old status quo, now we've implemented our new changes, and now it's time to make sure that those changes last by anchoring it into the culture. And this is something that I thought was really good, a really good example of what culture is. Culture is not something that you can manipulate easily. Attempts to grab it and twist it into a new shape never work because you can't grab it. Culture changes only after you have successfully altered people's actions. After the new behavior produces some group benefit for a period of time, and after people see the connection between the new actions and the improvement. In the book, he says, if you ever have anybody who comes and their first step of change is creating the culture, or is to change the culture, run, because it's never going to work, because people don't have the foundations necessary that we've established in the first 7 steps to actually buy in and actually have the culture be changed. So why is culture powerful? So remember, culture is a large number of people can see themselves, whether the result is real. Oh, I did not change this one. I'm sorry. I will update the presentation. So culture is overall is the norms and the shared values. So it's what we share as we value, but also the norms of behavior. So all of that kind of goes into what culture is, which is why you can't just change it, because you can't just instantly change people's behaviors or what they value, right? So yeah, that's what that is. Anchoring changes in culture. Cultural change comes last, not first, and it depends on the results. If you don't have any short-term wins, if you don't have all of these other steps, you're not going to have good and lasting change. It requires a lot of talk. So without verbal instruction and support, people are often reluctant to admit the validity of new practices. In the book, there's a quote where he says, intelligent people will not agree to changes unless they've had time to think about it. And we have a lot of intelligent people here. And just think about you. If I were to, at this moment, mandate that everyone has to wear purple on Thursdays, you guys, even though it's not really, it's kind of ridiculous to be like, well, I don't need to do that. He can't tell me what to do, right? Now, if I were to say, hey, we all need to wear purple on Thursdays because it's prostate awareness or whatever the other purple colors are, okay, maybe you might do that now, but it's still not going to change the culture in a long-lasting way. We need to have more talk. We need to have more explanation. This is also where like testimonials are really, really helpful. I think even just looking at a lot of changes in our society over the last 10 years, a lot of that is on the backs of testimonies, of people sharing their stories, their experiences. And that's very important. And it may involve turnover. Sometimes the only way to change the culture is to replace key people. And again, I don't think this is ever the first thing, and I don't even think it's necessarily a desired thing, but it is a reality. Some people just aren't going to get on board. I think it's a good. Someone once told me that leaders can often only get you to where you are. They can only get you to where they can get you. They can't get you to where you need to go all the time. So sometimes, you think of historic leaders. They got us to where we were, and they did a great job, but they might not have the ability to take us to the next level. That's just a reality, especially if they're actively rejecting the changes. That is something that is really not good. And then makes decisions on succession crucial. If promotion processes are not changed to be compatible with the new practices, the old culture will reassert itself. And so that's something that it's kind of a little bit in the weeds, I think, for some of us, but thinking about that in terms of our culture, like, are we rewarding those people who actually embody our culture? Are we promoting the people that do their jobs well in line with our vision, or they just have to do their jobs well? And I think overall, I think St. Luke's does a great job of promoting the right people and who are in line with our vision. But that's something we always have to be vigilant about, especially in a new change effort. So the other thing too I will mention about culture is, I already have alluded to the fact that culture isn't something that you can necessarily grab. It's also something that it needs to have the buy-in, not only from the guiding coalition, but from everybody. I think of cultures that are like ours. The patient above all else has been a key part of our culture for a long time. And I think if we had all of our key leaders leave, which I hope never happens, I still think that would ring true, because so many of our staff firmly believe that. And so that's where we really need to focus on doing that. I think in the book he talked about, oftentimes it takes at least 10 years to change the culture. Or to make these changes have an impact on the culture, because not only do the people who are around for the change happen are there, but then the new people that come in also have to believe in that culture and buy into that culture and that's basically how the old culture goes extinct, is that people in a lot of ways kind of forget what it was like back in the day before the new change in the culture. So I know that was a lot of content. It's dark in here, so thank you for dozing off. I appreciate it. We have a few minutes. Any questions? I'll go check the chat real quick too if there's questions there. All right, nothing. All right. Well, thank you all so much. I'll be around for a few more minutes if you do want to come up and ask questions or have other HR needs. Happy to help. I did send a copy of that PowerPoint as well. So if you have any other questions or any other needs, let me know. But again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for what you do in serving our patients and serving our employees. And have a great day.